She was just the crop duster nobody looked at twice: faded jeans, quiet eyes, an old yellow plane. But when an engine died at 18,000 feet, she didn't panic. She took command. And when two F-35s locked onto her voice on the radio, one word changed everything: Viper. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Grace's morning routine hadn't changed in the 18 months since she'd come home to Harmon County. Coffee at Dot's Diner before sunrise, a short flight over the Kessler and Anders farms to check wind conditions, then a full day of crop spraying until the light went orange and low over the cornfields. Dot's Diner was where the town's opinions of her had solidified early on. She was the quiet woman who flew the yellow plane. Old Frank Delgado, who'd farmed corn for 40 years and considered himself an authority on all matters aviation, liked to needle her about it whenever she sat at the counter. "Morning, fly girl," Frank said, not looking up from his newspaper. "They still letting you fly that thing without radar? Real pilots got radar." "I'm just saying. My nephew's in ROTC. Says real flying is different animal. Instruments, air traffic control, formation work. What you do is basically driving a lawnmower with wings." Grace let it go, the way she always did. She had learned, in the years since leaving the service, that correcting people rarely changed anything and always cost more than it was worth. Better to let Frank believe what he wanted to believe. Better to let the whole town believe it. Anonymity had a taste, and she had grown to like it, bitter and plain, like the coffee. "You ever think about doing something bigger?" Frank pressed, folding his paper. "Woman your age, decent hands, could probably get on with a regional airline. Fly real planes." "I like this plane just fine," Grace said, and left a 5 on the counter. What Frank didn't know, what nobody in that diner knew, was that 4 years earlier, over the mountains of eastern Syria, Grace Whitfield had engaged 3 enemy fighters in a 9-minute air battle that the Pentagon still classified as the Kesub Ridge engagement, and that she had walked away from every medal ceremony afterward feeling less like a hero and more like a woman who had simply survived what she was trained to survive. She had left the Air Force not because she had failed, but because she had succeeded too completely, in ways that made certain people uncomfortable. That story belonged to another life. This life belonged to Cornfields. The trouble started with a favor. Grace's neighbor, Ellen Marsh, ran a small charter operation out of the county's slightly larger airfield 30 miles east, Blackwood Regional, which handled a handful of commuter routes and private charters for businesspeople who didn't want to drive 2 hours to Omaha. Ellen's usual co-pilot had come down with the flu, and the scheduled flight, 11 passengers, a King Air 350 bound for Denver, needed a second qualified pilot in the right seat by law. "I know it's not your usual thing," Ellen said over the phone, sounding apologetic. "But you're rated on twins, aren't you? I saw it on your file when you did that AG spray certification renewal." "I'm rated," Grace admitted. "But I haven't flown right seat on anything with passengers in years. It's a milk run, Grace. 90 minutes to Denver, mostly business travelers. I need a warm body who knows which end of the yoke to hold. Please." Grace almost said no. Almost. But Ellen had covered 3 of her spray routes during a bad flu season the winter before, and debts like that mattered in a small county. She said yes. The passengers who boarded that morning were a cross-section of exactly the kind of people who assumed things about a woman in a rumpled flight jacket standing next to a twin turboprop. There was Daniel Whitcomb, a regional sales director in an expensive suit who eyed her up and down before asking, only half joking, if she was sure she knew how to fly this thing. There was a young intern named Priya Advani, headed to a conference, who made polite but pointed conversation about how different real instrument flying must be from whatever Grace normally did. And there was retired Colonel Walter Reyes, a stiff, silver-haired man in a golf polo who introduced himself as 22 years Army Aviation and spent the boarding process quizzing her on airspeeds like he was testing a student pilot. "You logged actual hours in twins, or just this crop duster stuff?" Reyes asked, settling into 4B. I've logged a fair number of hours, Grace said simply, running through the pre-flight checklist with Ellen. Reyes said, unconvinced, and opened a newspaper. Nobody on that airplane had any idea what she had actually flown. And Grace intended to keep it that way. She climbed into the right seat, ran the checklist alongside Ellen with the crisp, wordless efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times in aircraft far less forgiving than a King Air, and settled in for what she expected to be an uneventful 90 minutes. As the King Air taxied out, Priya Advani leaned across the aisle toward Grace, her tone friendly but faintly patronizing, the tone of someone trying to make an awkward stranger feel included. So do you, fly this route a lot? I didn't realize crop dusters could handle passenger charters. I don't usually, Grace said. I'm filling in for a sick pilot. That's so nice of you. Must be a big jump, though, going from those little yellow planes to something with actual instruments. Priya said it kindly, without any real malice, the way people say things when they've simply never been taught to think otherwise. I guess flying is flying, right? Something like that, Grace said, and went back to her checklist. Daniel Whitcomb, listening from across the cabin, couldn't resist adding his own commentary. I fly probably twice a month for work, he said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. You get a feel for good pilots versus nervous ones. No offense, but you seem like you're still getting used to being up here with real passengers. I've had passengers before, Grace said evenly. Sure. I just mean, this is a different animal than crop spraying. Traffic separation, weather routing, instrument approaches. It's a whole different skill set. Whitcomb settled back into his seat, satisfied with his own expertise. My father-in-law flew F-16s in the reserves. Now that's a different universe entirely. You should hear some of his stories. Grace said nothing, running her eyes down the checklist a second time. Colonel Reyes, several rows back, was watching the exchange over the top of his newspaper with the faint, unreadable expression of a man who had spent 2 decades learning not to underestimate anyone in a flight suit, but who, like everyone else on that airplane, had no particular reason yet to apply that lesson to her. She climbed into the right seat and settled in for what she expected to be an uneventful 90 minutes. She was wrong. 41 minutes into the flight, cruising at 18,000 feet over the eastern Colorado plains, the King Air's left engine surged twice and then died completely. The aircraft yawed hard left. Overhead bins rattled. Somewhere behind them, a passenger yelped. Ellen fought the controls, feathering the dead prop by reflex, but her voice when she spoke had an edge of real fear in it. Left engine's gone, Ellen said. I've got the prop feathered, but, Grace, I'm reading a fuel imbalance warning and the electrical bus just dropped voltage. Something's wrong with more than the engine. Grace's hands were already moving. In the space of a heartbeat, the version of her that had spent a decade flying single-seat combat aircraft through hostile airspace, managing multiple emergencies simultaneously while people shot real missiles at her, simply woke up and took over. Cross-feed the fuel, Grace said, voice flat and calm. You've got a blockage or a pump failure on the left side, not a real imbalance. Watch your right engine temps, if it's actually a contamination issue, it'll show up there too. How do you do it, Ellen? We can talk about it after we're on the ground. Ellen cross-fed the fuel. The right engine, which had been running slightly rough, smoothed out immediately. Confirmed contamination, Grace said. Not a mechanical failure. You've got water or debris in the left tank. Declare an emergency now, request the nearest suitable field, and let me handle the radios while you fly. Behind them, the cabin had gone from murmuring to outright panic. Daniel Whitcomb was gripping his armrests white-knuckled. Priya Advani had both hands pressed over her mouth. Colonel Reyes, to his credit, had gone quiet and alert, watching the cockpit with the focused attention of a man trying to remember training he hadn't used in 20 years. Grace keyed the radio, her voice suddenly carrying an authority that made Ellen glance sideways at her. Denver Center, Charter 529er declaring an emergency, single engine failure, fuel contamination suspected, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airfield with emergency equipment standing by. 11 souls on board. 529er, Denver Center, roger your emergency. Turn right heading 090, descend and maintain 2000. Colorado Springs Municipal is 31 miles, emergency equipment will be standing by. Copy, turning right 090, descending 2000. Requesting a straight-in approach, we have degraded performance on a single engine. Ellen banked the aircraft, sweat visible on her forehead. Grace, I need you to help me fly this. My hands are shaking. You're doing fine. Trim for single engine climb configuration, watch your minimum controllable airspeed, and don't fight the yaw, let the rudder do the work, not the ailerons. Grace's hands hovered near the controls but didn't take them, guiding instead of overriding. You've flown single engine failures in the sim. This is the same physics. Just slower and with more people watching. How are you so calm? Grace didn't answer immediately. Outside the cockpit windows, the plains of eastern Colorado stretched out gold and endless, and for one strange moment she thought of Syria, of mountains instead of farmland, of missile warning tones instead of a fuel imbalance chime, of a cockpit built for one instead of a cabin full of frightened strangers. Because this isn't the worst emergency I've ever flown, she said quietly. Not even close. It was somewhere over the outskirts of Colorado Springs that the radio traffic changed. Charter 529er, be advised, we have military traffic requesting to establish contact. 2 aircraft out of Peterson, call sign Longbow Flight. Grace frowned slightly. Fighter escorts for a civilian single-engine emergency were unusual. Peterson typically scrambled for airspace violations or intercepts, not to babysit a King Air with a dead motor. But she keyed the radio anyway. Longbow Flight, Charter 529er, go ahead. There was a pause on the radio. Then a new voice, younger, tighter with barely suppressed disbelief. 529er, Longbow 1. We picked up your transmission on guard frequency, the way you were talking pilot to pilot with your co-pilot on that fuel cross-feed call. Ma'am, is this Major Whitfield? Call sign Viper. Ellen's head snapped toward Grace so fast she nearly lost the aircraft's trim. Colonel Reyes, listening on his seat's audio jack, went rigid. Grace closed her eyes for half a second. 3 years. 3 years of cornfields and quiet mornings and nobody in Harmon County knowing her name, and it had taken exactly one radio transmission for the old world to reach out and grab her by the collar. This is Whitfield, she said finally. I'm not current, Longbow. I'm flying right seat on a civilian emergency. Ma'am, with respect, we heard how you talked that fuel imbalance through in under 10 seconds. Half the guys in my squadron trained on your Kessa Bridge debrief. It's an honor, ma'am. Requesting permission to escort you in. Permission granted, Longbow. And thank you, but focus on airspace deconfliction, not sightseeing. We've got a real engine problem up here. Copy that, ma'am. Longbow Flight, forming up left and right of 529er. Through the cockpit windows, 2 F-35s slid into position on either side of the crippled King Air, matching its reduced speed with the effortless, almost insulting ease of aircraft built to fly 3 times as fast. Passengers pressed against the small oval windows, phones out, murmuring in disbelief. Daniel Whitcomb, the sales director who had asked Grace if she knew which end of the yoke to hold, stared at the fighters with his mouth open. Grace, Ellen said, voice tight with something between fear and awe as she fought to hold the descent stable, what did that pilot just call you? Not now, Ellen. Airspeed's bleeding off, bring the nose down 2 degrees and watch your bank angle. We're not done yet. While Ellen fought to keep the King Air stable during the long, tense descent toward Colorado Springs, Grace's mind, trained by years of discipline to stay locked entirely on the present moment during an emergency, nonetheless let one memory surface, brief and involuntary, the way a scar sometimes aches before rain. For years earlier, over the jagged mountains east of Kessa Bridge, she had been flying lead in a two-ship formation when her wingman took a hit from a shoulder-launched missile and lost half his hydraulic system in the same instant that two enemy fighters dropped out of a cloud bank behind them. There had been no 31 miles to a safe runway that day. There had been no air traffic controller calmly vectoring her toward help. There had been only her, a damaged wingman calling out over a radio thick with static, and a decision that had to be made in under 4 seconds or not at all. She had made it in 3. The engagement that followed, 9 minutes of maneuvering at speeds and angles that no simulator fully replicated, ending with 2 enemy aircraft destroyed and a third driven off, her wingman limping home on one functioning hydraulic system, had earned her a Distinguished Flying Cross, a spot in every tactics manual written afterward, and precisely the kind of attention that made certain people in the Pentagon deeply uncomfortable. A woman, at the center of the most decisive single air engagement of the campaign, photographed shaking hands with generals who would rather have had a different face attached to the story. The tactics were hers. The credit, in the press releases that followed, was carefully diffused. She had never spoken about Kessa Bridge to anyone in Harmon County. Not to Frank Delgado, not to Ellen, not even to the handful of people she'd let close enough to call friends. It wasn't shame, exactly. It was simpler than that, a private conviction that some things, once spoken aloud in a place like a diner or a farmhouse porch, stopped being memories and started being performances, stories other people repeated with the details slowly worn smooth and wrong. Sitting in the right seat of a struggling King Air, guiding Ellen through a single-engine approach with the same measured calm she'd once used to talk a wounded wingman home across hostile terrain, Grace understood, not for the first time, but more clearly than she had in 3 years, that the skill had never actually left her. She had only stopped using it in public. Grace, Ellen said, snapping her back to the moment. Descent checklist, please. I need you here. I'm here, Grace said, and meant it completely. The approach into Colorado Springs Municipal was, by any professional standard, a difficult one, a single-engine King Air, degraded electrical systems, a co-pilot who had never flown an actual emergency landing outside of simulator training, and 11 passengers whose collective fear had gone quiet and watchful, the particular silence of people who have realized that panic will not help them. Grace talked Ellen through every stage of the approach, her voice never rising, never wavering, the same voice that had once talked young lieutenants through their first combat sorties over hostile territory. Gear down, good, 3 green, you're configured. Watch your airspeed, don't let it drop below blue line, you lose that margin and you lose your ability to go around if something else fails. Nice and steady. You've got this. Runway in sight, Ellen said, her voice cracking with relief. Then fly it exactly like you've been flying the last 10 minutes. Don't relax yet. Landing's the easy part that kills people who relax too soon. The King Air touched down hard on the right main gear first, bounced once, then settled onto the runway in a landing that would never win any smoothness awards but that got 11 people and 2 pilots onto solid ground alive. Fire trucks and ambulances raced alongside as the aircraft rolled to a stop, exactly as trained emergency response should. Inside the cabin, the silence broke all at once into ragged, relieved applause and a few muffled sobs. Ellen sat frozen at the controls for a moment, hands still gripping the yoke, breathing hard. We're down, she said, disbelieving. We're actually down. You flew that landing, Grace said. Not me. Remember that. I couldn't have done it without you talking me through it. You'll do it without me next time. That's how it works. Outside, the 2 F-35s broke formation and climbed away in a slow, deliberate victory roll that had every passenger pressed against the windows again, phones held up, filming. In the cabin, Colonel Reyes unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up despite his old knees protesting, and made his way to the cockpit door. Major Whitfield, he said, and his voice had lost every trace of its earlier condescension. I served 22 years and I have never in my life heard a radio call handled like that. Kessa Bridge, that was you? The 3-kill engagement over the ridge line? That was a long time ago, Colonel. It was extraordinary, is what it was. Reyes shook his head slowly. I asked you this morning if you'd logged actual hours in twins. I feel like an old fool. You didn't know, Grace said. Nobody did. That was the point. By the time Grace made it back to Harmon County 2 days later, the story had already outrun her. A grainy cell phone video of the two F-35s escorting a crippled King Air into Colorado Springs had gone viral overnight, and a Denver news affiliate had tracked down enough details to run a segment titled, "Mystery Co-Pilot Was Decorated Fighter Ace." Nobody in the segment used her name, the Air Force hadn't confirmed anything publicly, but Ellen had talked, one relieved phone call at a time, and small counties do not keep secrets well. Frank Delgado was waiting for her at the counter of Dot's Diner the next morning, newspaper folded in front of him, looking uncharacteristically sheepish. Heard some things, he said. Frank. My nephew called me. Said the internet's saying some crop duster out of Harmon County used to fly F-35s. Said her call sign was Viper. Said she talked a King Air through an engine failure like it was nothing. He looked at her carefully. That true? Grace sat down on her usual stool and let out a long breath. 3 years of careful anonymity, undone in 72 hours by a bad fuel filter and a favor for a neighbor. It's true, she said finally. Frank was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the counter. I called what you do driving a lawnmower with wings, he said. That was a stupid thing to say. You didn't know. Doesn't make it not stupid. He pushed his coffee aside. Why'd a woman who used to fly the most advanced fighter jet in the world come back here to spray my soybeans? Grace considered the question, the way she'd been considering it, in one form or another, for 3 years. Because up there, she said, nodding vaguely toward the sky, everything was loud. Committees, cameras, people who wanted a piece of the story, people who couldn't decide if a woman with my record was an asset or a problem. Down here, it's quiet. Nobody wants anything from me except a good spray pattern before the rain comes in. And now? Now everybody knows, Grace said. So I guess we'll see. Frank turned his coffee cup another slow rotation, working up to something. My nephew wants to know if you'd talk to his ROTC unit sometime. Before all this, I would have told him not to bother a busy woman with questions like that. Now I don't know what to tell him. Tell him to ask me himself, Grace said. I don't bite. He's convinced you do, a little. Frank almost smiled. In a good way, I think he means. Later that afternoon, as Grace was loading chemical tanks for the next day's spray run, Ellen pulled up in her truck, looking better rested than she had since the emergency but still carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had recently stared down her own mortality and come out the other side different. I keep thinking about it, Ellen admitted, leaning against the hangar door. How fast you knew what was wrong. I've flown twins for 9 years and I would have burned through half our fuel reserve chasing the wrong diagnosis. You'd have figured it out, Grace said. Eventually. Maybe. But eventually isn't a word you want in your head at 18,000 feet with 11 people behind you. Ellen studied her for a moment. Are you going to go back? To the Air Force, I mean. Everybody in town's already placing bets. There are bets? Frank's got a pool going at the diner. I didn't put money on it. Felt like bad luck. Grace laughed for the first time in days, surprising herself with how easily it came. Tell Frank I haven't decided anything yet. He'll be disappointed. He was hoping you'd confirm it so he could collect. The call came 4 days later, in the evening, while Grace was sitting on the porch of the small farmhouse she rented at the edge of town, watching contrails cross a darkening sky. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Marcus Webb, her former squadron commander, a man she hadn't spoken to since the day she signed her separation paperwork. Grace. It's Webb. Colonel. I saw the video. Everybody saw the video. You realize you're trending, right? Cornfield pilot turns out to be Air Force legend, it's on every feed in the country. I didn't ask for any of that. I know you didn't. That's exactly why I'm calling. Webb's voice softened. Grace, I know why you left. I know what happened with the Kesub Ridge fallout, the political mess, all of it. I never agreed with how they handled your separation, and I said so at the time, for whatever that was worth. It wasn't worth much, Grace said, without bitterness, just fact. No, Webb admitted. It wasn't. But things have changed. We're short experienced pilots across 3 squadrons. The kids we're training now grew up watching your Kesub Ridge briefing in flight school, and they don't understand why the woman who wrote half the tactics manual is spraying corn in Nebraska. Grace watched the contrails fade into the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, young pilots like the ones in longbow flight were flying training sorties, learning tactics she had helped develop, wondering, the way Lieutenant Priya Advani had wondered on that King Air, the way Frank Delgado had wondered his whole misguided life, what it actually took to be good at something like this. What are you offering, Colonel? A training command. Not a desk job, an actual squadron, aggressor tactics, full authority over the syllabus. You'd be shaping how the next generation flies, not just flying yourself into another political mess. And if it goes sideways again? If some general decides my face doesn't fit the narrative he wants, then I'll fight that battle in writing, on record, before you ever sign anything, Webb said. I should have fought it the first time. I didn't. I'm not making that mistake twice. Grace sat in silence for a long moment, the porch light humming faintly behind her, the corn rustling in the dark fields beyond the fence line. I'll think about it, she said finally. That's all I'm asking. She flew her usual route the next morning, low over the Kessler fields, the anders spread, the long rows of soybeans that needed treating before the first hard frost. The yellow crop duster handled exactly the way it always had, honest, uncomplicated, forgiving of small mistakes in a way that fighter jets never were. Below her, Harmon County looked the way it always looked from 300 feet, a quilt of gold and green stitched together by gravel roads, the diner's tin roof catching the early light, a scattering of grain silos standing like sentries over the fields. It was a good life. A quiet one. She had built it carefully, out of the wreckage of the life before it, and some stubborn part of her did not want to give it up simply because the world had suddenly remembered her name. But she thought about Ellen's hands shaking on the King Air's yoke, steadied only by someone telling her, calmly, exactly what to do. She thought about Longbow One's voice on the radio, young and eager and half in disbelief that the pilot studied in his own flight school briefings were real people who could still fly. She thought about a generation of aviators who would fly into situations far more dangerous than a fuel-contaminated twin engine over the Colorado plains, and who deserved to learn from someone who had actually lived through the worst of it and come out the other side. She thought, too, about Frank Delgado calling his own comments stupid, unprompted, the first time in 3 years she'd heard him admit to being wrong about anything. Landing back at Harmon County Regional that afternoon, Grace taxied the crop duster to its usual spot near the fuel pumps and sat in the cockpit for a long moment after the engine wound down, listening to the propeller click slowly to a stop. Then she took out her phone and called Colonel Webb. I have conditions, she said, without preamble. Name them. I train pilots. I don't do press conferences, I don't do congressional hearings, and I don't spend my career being someone's convenience story about diversity in the cockpit. I did the job because I was good at it. That's the only reason I want to go back. Agreed, Webb said. All of it. And I keep the crop duster, Grace added. Some weekends, I still want to fly something that doesn't answer to anybody but me. Webb actually laughed. Deal, Major. Welcome back. 3 weeks later, Grace Whitfield stood on the flight line at Nellis Air Force Base, wearing a flight suit with Viper stitched above the breast pocket, watching a new class of young pilots file into the briefing room for their first session under her command. Longbow 1, Lieutenant Danny Reyes, as it turned out, no relation to the colonel from the King Air, though he'd never stop being asked, was among them, having requested a transfer the moment he heard who would be running the aggressor squadron. "Ma'am," one of the younger pilots asked as the briefing began, "is it true you used to fly crop dusters?" Grace looked out at the row of eager faces, thinking of cornfields and diner counters in a county that had taught her, without meaning to, exactly what quiet competence looked like when nobody was watching. "Still do," she said. "Every chance I get. It teaches you something the fighters can't." "What's that, ma'am?" "That the airplane doesn't care who's flying it or what people think you're capable of. It only cares whether you do the job right." She looked around the room, meeting each pilot's eyes in turn. "Everything else, the call signs, the headlines, the people who underestimate you, that's just noise. Fly the airplane. Bring your people home. That's the whole job." Outside, 2 F-35s took off in tight formation, engines roaring against a wide Nevada sky, and Colonel Grace Whitfield, Viper, once more, watched them go with the quiet, settled satisfaction of a woman who had finally found a way to belong fully to both of her lives at once.